All right, guys, quick lesson today. This is a hard one to do without actually being here in person. A lot of what you missed in class is questions, examples, a lot of the back and forth that happened between me and your classmates is what kind of led the discussion and what went into these notes. And so I'm going to try to cover some of the basics. But if you're watching this video because you were not here, as you are doing the story problems for this homework assignment, take notes, mark problems, and when you come to class next time, at the beginning, let's talk about it. Ask those questions that you weren't here to ask during the lesson, and I can try to clear up some of that stuff, okay? But there's a common theme in a lot of story problems, and common themes, and I'm just going to cover a few strategies, a few common themes that might help you with some of the story problems today, okay? For example, if you think about what we learned in the review chapter, we learned a few different things. We learned about solving equations, railroad tracks, that sort of stuff. We learned about proportions. We learned about percents. And we learned, what was our third one? Why am I drawing a blank on our third assignment? That was the calculator day, right? Like fractions, decimals, percent, substituting. So we did a bunch of calculator substitution, converting numbers from one version to another, that kind of stuff. So first of all, that's what we just got done learning. So the topics that are going to be part of the story problems are probably going to come back to these skills, right? Not all of them. Some of them will require additional things, but for the most part, the story problems are going to involve these skills. So that's your first clue going into each of these problems, is you're looking for one of those concepts to help you. Now, big ideas, comparison. Anytime, I've told you before, on the ACT, usually about 25 to 30% of the questions are comparing something to another. Shadows to heights, cups of sugar to gallons of lemonade, miles per gallon to cost of gas. You make this much per hour and you work this many hours, right? It's comparing two different things to each other. Now, anytime you see a story problem where it is comparing something of one unit, like sugar, cups of sugar, to something of another unit, like gallons of lemonade, that is a quick clue that that it's comparing something and it wants you to use a proportion, or maybe it wants you to do something else, and who cares, because the proportion is the best way to do it. So anytime you see something being compared, your first thought should be use a proportion. Be careful that whatever you put on the top matches on both sides, right? Whatever you put on the bottom matches. Sugar goes on top, lemonade goes on bottom. Miles per gallon on top, dollars per gallon on bottom. Shadow length on top, object length on bottom. Okay, so once you get that set up, it's really easy to cross multiply and divide. So look for comparisons. If you ever see the word proportional or proportion, that's a good clue that you should be using a proportion, right? Proportional sounds a lot like proportion. Keep that in mind. Okay, substituting, solving, evaluating. So a lot of times you will be reading a story problem and it will say something like it'll say something like, this equation uses the number of hours, and then it'll say H after number of hours. That's a clue that some number it gives you or wants you to find is going to go in the place of H. And a lot of times it actually gives you that value. One of my favorite ACT questions, because it's so easy, but everyone skips them because the sentence or the story problem might look long. But it will give you a formula with one letter in it. And then it will give you a value for that letter, but it won't say the letter. It'll say something like H is the height of a baseball. And then it gives you this big long paragraph. And then it'll say if a baseball goes 150 feet, and it'll ask you, it'll want you to plug that value in everywhere there was an H in the formula. And they're so simple, they're so easy, but they're kind of hidden behind this great big story problem. So it's intimidating for a lot of people. I love those questions. I wish they weren't so intimidating, but I like that if you can work through it, it shouldn't be difficult to actually solve when you give it an effort. So look for designated variables, okay? And as soon as you see a variable, look to see if there's a number in the story problem that matches, okay? So you want to match numbers to variables and plug them in. A lot of times it will give you a story about purchasing tickets or buying a car, and it will give you the information in a way that you can write an equation or an expression, and then you just have to solve or simplify it. So you're going to be, those are ones where you are turning words into math symbols, right? And we've talked about that a lot in this chapter. There are some, that kind of goes with what I was just talking about, where it wants you to create an equation or an expression. I got ahead of myself a little bit. In these story problems, obviously it doesn't just give it to you because it's a story problem. Though there will be some on the ACT that it might just give you the equation. Usually it wants you to turn it into an equation based on what you're reading. So look for those keywords, is of, percent, proportion, sum, increases, decreases, multiples, multiply. You're looking for those keywords to help you create the equation. Changing in percent. Now, this is one way that story problems really like to throw you off. It'll give you a number, or a lot of times these are like shopping questions, and it will want you to change that number based on a percent. Sometimes it'll want you to change it multiple times in a different order, and it's trying to trick you into combining all the percents together first and then changing it. So when you're changing percent, I just need you to remember that you've got to change the percent, get the new number before you use the new percent. Okay. For example, what would be? I don't want to give away story problems on the homework. If you earn a certain dollar amount, and it tells you that you get a 5% raise, and then it asks, what percent of tax are you going to pay on your new income? Well, you have to do the 5% raise first and find the new value, and then figure out the tax percentage of the new value. You can't do the 5 and the tax at the same time. It doesn't work that way. So anytime there's a change in percent, make sure that you're finding the new value. Make sure that you're finding the new value before applying the next percent. Okay. The ACT loves this with discount questions. Okay. You get 25% off, and then you get another 10% of the sale price. That's not the same as taking 35% off. You've got to take the 25 off, then the 10%. So be careful of those percent ones, but it's a good clue that you should be applying percents to numbers when you see those words being used, right? Last thing I want to talk about is using sample numbers. Sometimes it will give you a theoretical number question, and it'll say like, if you multiply 5 consecutive numbers, and it'll ask you a question about what happens. Well, that's really hard to do theoretically. Sometimes it helps if you pick numbers and plug them into the situation. You know, if it says multiply 5 consecutive numbers, pick 5 numbers and multiply them together. Do 2 times 3 times 4 times 5 times 6. 0 and 1 are usually not good things to multiply by when you're making up numbers, because 0 makes everything disappear and 1 makes it not change. So those I don't usually like to use. When you're dividing, if it says 2 consecutive even numbers and you're dividing, I don't usually like to divide. Well, I guess in that case 2 might be okay. 2's a little bit funny. I don't like to use 2 when I'm multiplying, dividing, and doing exponents, because so many times 2 is a counterexample to a rule and it can mess up the theory. But yeah, if it says something about dividing consecutive even numbers, well, you pick 2 consecutive even numbers, 40 and 42. You divide those and see what happens, and then pick 2 different ones, 4 and 6, see what happens. If it just says a number is increased or divided or multiplied or added to X, pick a number. Again, I don't like 0, 1, and 2 because they do weird things. If you multiply by 0 or 1, if you add 0, you know, that weird stuff happens. So maybe pick a number that's easier to work with, or that's easy to work with, but not 0, 1, and 2. 100 is great, especially with percent problems, because it's usually easy to find percents of 100 because they match the word percent. And it's 100. It's easy to cut 100 in half, or to double it, or to break it into 4 pieces, or to find 30%, right? 10 is another good one. If you just need to pick a random number to try plugging in and see what happens. But when you're using sample numbers, pick numbers that you're comfortable with, but be careful that there's not other interactions going on because of the number that you picked. Try to fit numbers that, again, avoid 0 and 1 and 2 usually. Instead of using 2, use 3. It's not that much bigger. If it wants you to do a bunch of multiplication, maybe use 5, because multiplying by 5 is an easy number to multiply by. If it wants you to add even numbers, maybe instead of 10, pick the next one, 4, right? So when the opportunity arises, put numbers in, see what happens, and just be a little strategic when you pick those numbers, okay? If it's saying something should happen with consecutive integers are just numbers, so like 3 and 4, or 101 and 102, or -6 and -5. Those are consecutive integers. If it says that if I do this to consecutive integers, this happens, it shouldn't matter what integers you pick. So pick ones that you like, pick numbers that you're comfortable with. Okay, story problems. Again, I'm sorry if you weren't here. This was very much a work together, interact, ask questions along the way, kind of a homework. So maybe call a couple buddies, get a little group together, and maybe you can do this homework. Even though you weren't in class to work on it together, maybe it's something you can make a little study group to work on at home in the evening or over the weekend or something like that. So good luck. Come hit me up if you have any questions.